Buckle up, folks, the dream of cheaper borrowing just got a cold shower from Australia's inflation numbers, and it might be here to stay longer than we hoped. If you're counting on the Reserve Bank of Australia, RBA, to slash interest rates anytime soon, think again. But here's where it gets controversial. Was the RBA ever really planning to cut rates, or were they just waiting for an excuse to hold steady? Let's dive into the latest economic twists and turns that have dashed those hopes, and unpack why this matters for your wallet. Picture this: is there any economic announcement that can crush expectations faster than fresh inflation data? Just ahead of the release of the September Quarter Consumer Price Index, CPI, figures from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, ABS, optimism was buzzing. Many thought Melbourne Cup Day might bring the gift of lower interest rates from the RBA. But alas, those hopes evaporated quicker than a Melbourne Cup favourite in the home stretch, thanks to the latest stats. The quarterly inflation growth clocked in at 1.2%, roughly double what economists and investors had penciled in. For beginners wondering what this means, inflation measures how much prices are rising over time, and a higher than expected jump like this signals the economy is heating up more than anticipated. This puts the brakes on any planned rate cuts. If the graph does not display, click here, https://www.datarapper.de/_/_gz1fc. So, farewell to the idea of lower interest rates for now. And this is the part most people miss. Truthfully, the RBA seemed primed for any justification to keep rates as they are, rather than dive into cuts. On Monday night, RBA Governor Michele Bullock addressed the Australian Business Economists' annual dinner, adopting a calm demeanour about the recent unemployment spike to 4.5%. She acknowledged it as a bit of a surprise, but brushed it off as monthly numbers can be volatile. Her conclusion: it's still pretty low, compared with where it was pre-COVID. Now, for context, pre-COVID unemployment was indeed higher, but back in 2019, fears of a recession were rampant. Remember how everyone was worried about economic downturns? Bullock's comparison might seem reassuring, but it glosses over how far we've come, or not, since then. Still, she used it to argue against rate cuts. With inflation now at 3.2% over the past year, up from 2.1% in the year to June, that's the fourth largest annual inflation increase in the last 40 years, giving the RBA a solid alibi to sideline rising unemployment concerns. If the graph does not display, click here, https://www.datarapper.de/_/0DSWP. So, what's behind this inflation blip? Where did our hopes for keeping prices within the RBA's sweet spot of 2% to 3% vanish? It's helpful to understand that the RBA targets a range because perfect stability is tricky. Think of it as aiming for a comfortable room temperature rather than freezing or boiling. Consider the trimmed mean, a key underlying inflation measure favored by the RBA and rate cut advocates. It stood at 2.95%. The weighted median, another gauge, hit 2.85%. Both are comfortably inside the target band, so no major freakout required. The CPI spiked because, unlike these smooth measures, it captures dramatic price swings without filtering them out. This quarter's story: massive leaps in electricity prices, fueled by the phasing out of state subsidies. These hikes made up about 15% of the total inflation bump, even though electricity only represents 1.8% of average household spending. Imagine if a small but essential item in your grocery basket suddenly cost way more. It skews your whole budget. Property rates and charges also surged, alongside new dwelling purchases, essentially the cost to build a new home. These factors amplified the inflation push. If the graph does not display, click here, https://www.datarapper.de/_/0NB0D. To grasp the subsidies' full effect, let's peek at electricity prices in Perth and Brisbane. In Brisbane during the September quarter, prices were a staggering 1,694% higher than a year ago, but that's not because actual costs skyrocketed. Instead, households are now footing the full bill without the state rebate that cushioned them before. If the graph does not display, click here, https://www.datarapper.de/xk1u5. Looking at the broader picture, the state rebates influence has largely faded, with only the federal one still in play. This isn't necessarily a disaster. Subsidies were designed to cool inflation when it was raging at 6% annually before September 2023. Now, at 3.2%, they are easing off as intended, like turning down the thermostat once the room cools. If the graph does not display, click here, https://www.datarapper.de/c0jwj/?v=5. The silver lining. Most other prices stayed relatively stable. The inflation rise stemmed from a handful of items jumping over 5% in the past year, while the number of price drops remained unchanged. If the graph does not display, click here, https://www.datarapper.de/_/tbsnc. But here's the controversial kicker: inflation is disproportionately driven by essentials like electricity, property rates, and rents, that non-discretionary must-haves that you can't skimp on. In contrast, luxury or discretionary items, think vacations or gadgets, only rose 2.4% on average. Since wealthier households spend more on luxuries, this hits lower-income families hardest, widening the wealth gap. And with no rate cuts in sight, those who've refinanced mortgages at higher rates or are still paying off loans will feel the pinch most. If the graph does not display, click here, https://www.datarapper.de/_/VRN0x. It's a stark reminder that both inflation itself and the remedy of higher interest rates tend to burden younger and less affluent households more severely than those with ample savings. For example, a young family saving for their first home might struggle with rising rents, while a retiree with a paid-off mortgage sails through. What do you think? Is the RBA right to prioritize inflation control over unemployment, even if it means tougher times for everyday Aussies? Or should they be more aggressive about cuts to ease the burden on low-income groups? Do you agree that subsidies worked as planned, or were they just a band-aid? Share your views in the comments. I'm curious to hear if this sparks debate.